Mr Speaker, the bill that we are debating today is another bill that was actually developed by the 5th Labor government, and I'd like to acknowledge the excellent work done by the previous Minister of Courts, my colleague the Honourable Rick Barker. Although not all of his proposals made it through, this bill is still a reflection of his hard work as the former Minister of Courts, so I would like to congratulate Mr Rick Barker for that. Before I get stuck into the detail of this bill, I do need to point out a slight contradiction that was just made in the House by one of the previous speakers from the Māori Party. Now, the Māori Party are voting against this bill because they disagree with the measures. They disagree. You're voting for? They're voting for the bill now? Oh. But they disagree with the measures around collecting the fees. Okay. Well, there was something in Dahu's speech around concerns around the disproportionate effect on Māori with regards to collecting the fines and with regards to where the fines go. Yeah. Now, I just want to remind the House that in 2008, in December 2008, there was an Education National Standards Amendment Bill, and with that we saw the doubling of the fines with regards to truancy, and that's a bill that the Māori Party did actually support, even though there may have been an argument put at that time that Māori would be disproportionately affected by that. So I think in some ways there is a slight contradiction with regards to that. Now anyway, Mr Speaker, according to the current Courts Minister, this is the most comprehensive set of legislation measures designed to strengthen the recovery of unpaid fines and penalties in 12 years. And it is critical, in brackets, quote, critical to the credibility of the justice system, end quote, as it establishes better processes for monetary penalties. It is certainly worthwhile legislation, we agree on this side. That is why Labor developed it when we were in government. But unfortunately, National has been in government for almost 18 months now, and it's taken this long for them to actually bring that to the House. Now, we struggle to understand why, if it is that important, as the Minister of Courts, the Honourable Georgina Tehuhu has pointed out, why it has taken 18 months to actually bring to first reading now. Now, the legislation was almost ready to go when they took office. Rick Barker had done the lion's share of work on it. So something that they consider as important as this bill still took them a year and a half to come to Parliament. And this despite the government's tough on crime rhetoric, empty rhetoric. Yesterday when we were debating the 3 strikes legislation, a bill which we've been told by the Ministry of Justice will do nothing to act as a deterrent to crime. We've had advisors and other people tell us that basically what we'll see with this is just more taxpayers' money going towards punitive measures rather than taxpayers' money being freed up to put into places like education and health or into rehabilitation programs. Also, we were told with regards to this bill, and we heard from this side of the House, that basically what we're seeing with the 3 strikes bill is that the result will be that a lot of money will go on to the private companies that government will give the contracts to run our private prisons. And yet that one was seen as urgent enough to push through, despite the fact that it was incredibly controversial. And then this one, which we agree with on this side of the House, they agree with over there, took 18 months to actually bring to fruition and bring into the House for the first reading. So I guess on this side we just have to be glad that at the end of the day it did make it here. We just wonder why, oh why, it took so long. Now Labor will be supporting this bill as it is a result of the work that Rick Barker had done as Minister of Courts, work that we do consider to be very important. And it's important to recognise that courts are wiping millions and millions of dollars a year of unpaid fines. Meanwhile, the amount of outstanding money owed continues to grow, and it is a problem that does need to be addressed. And what we've seen with regards to the fines, the figures released earlier this year show that between July 2008 and June 2009, the courts wiped $95.1 million of the total $806 million in unpaid fines. And I guess common sense tells us that if we are actually going to charge these fines, then we are actually going to collect on them as well. Now, the amount of outstanding fines is increasing each year, and given the large and growing amount of outstanding penalties, the effectiveness of monetary penalties as a sanction for offending is being eroded. The regulatory impact statement of this bill says that many people can afford to pay their fines, but choose not to until costly enforcement action is taken. And I think often the line is run that people can't afford to pay the fines, and in some cases that is the case. But I mean, the research here says that actually a large number of them can afford to pay the fine, they just don't get around to doing it until action is taken. Now, the amount of unpaid fines remitted to community work has more than tripled over the last 5 years, from 16.6 million in 2005 to 55.7 million last year. Now, there are a few other things that I want to touch on with regards to this. The fines and monetary penalties are only effective if there are procedures in place to enforce the penalties. Without that, these penalties are just empty threats and will do nothing to deter the criminals. And I guess what we don't want to see is us putting legislation through, and I mean that could involve fines like we saw in the Education National Standards Amendment Bill with the truancy fine. The truancy fines doubled. What we don't want to see is us putting legislation through that is purely aspirational with regards to fines, with no intention to ever collect on them. Now, one of this bill's major policy proposals is the driver licence stop orders, or the DLSOs for short, initiative, and I would like to take the time to discuss this in a little bit more detail now. The driver licence stop order initiative is a new method of enforcement that would allow the suspension of people's driver's licence if they have not paid or given intention to pay outstanding traffic penalties. The DLSO scheme was approved by the last Labor government in July 2008. It is based on similar successful initiatives, notably in Australia, where these orders have greatly improved the rates of collecting fines. In Queensland, the scheme is successful in collecting 3/4 of fines owed by people who are threatened with licence suspension or who have their licences suspended because of unpaid fines, as well as Australia, Canada, the US and other countries all have driver licence suspension as a fine compliance measure. So another major policy proposal in this bill is the credit reporting. So through this system, private sector lending companies and others will be able to find out if someone has overdue penalties. This will encourage people to pay fines and will make them more accountable for the money they owe. It also means that the Ministry of Justice can use information stored by credit reporting agencies to collect the fines. Now, this system will affect people who can afford to pay fines but choose not to because they have not previously faced any serious consequences for not paying. Now, we will be supporting this bill, but I'd just like to make it clear that it isn't the bill that the Labor government would have passed. We would have liked to have seen a great deal more ambition and reach in this bill. It has potential, but it stops short of addressing some of the more pressing matters related to the issue of unpaid court fines. For example, there are over, you're a bit premature, Mr Camcorder, there are over 80 issuing authorities dealing with these fines. This is crazy. It also hinders the successful collection of fines. If this bill were to create a single agency to deal with court fines, which is what the Labor government intended and what this side of the House would have preferred with this legislation, this would have been a great improvement and we would see a much better rate of fine collection. Labor did suggest this, but it has been left out of the bill before the House today. I'm unsure of the logic or the reasons, or I'm unsure of whether there was any logic or any reasons given. This is an example of the kind of forward thinking that we would have liked to have incorporated into the bill. Now, another important matter that seems not to have been considered is the feasibility of huge fines, especially when a person being fined is young. Research from the Justice Ministry has shown that once people cross a certain threshold of money owed, and for young people this threshold is usually around $2,000, not only are they unable to pay the amount, but they become unwilling to even try paying off some of the fine. And the last thing we want is for our young people to be burdened with unnecessary fines, and so it would have been good if this bill had taken it into consideration in some way or another. And I just go back to what my colleague Jacinda Ardern was talking about before, because she did make the connection to the fact that our Minister of Courts is also the Minister of Pacific Island, the Ministry of